Thank you. Welcome, everybody. We move to the third evening of this study, and we look at God of nations, God of war, with a big question mark after that. The Irish and the British national anthems strike me as being both militaristic and concerned with fighting and victory. So too is the French anthem and Flower of Scotland. The Welsh anthem is a celebration of landscape and nature and maybe an exception as far as anthems go. National constitutions also tend to invoke God, which has raised a question: who is the God of national constitutions? God is usually a major player in war. Each of the 6 empires in World War I claimed quite explicitly to have God on their side, and they believed they were fighting a holy war. Again, who is this God? It's not difficult to find support in the Bible, at least support from interpretations of the Bible, given that the Bible is always interpreted. Amos, the first of the written prophets at work in the mid-8th century BCE, launched straight in with a series of war declarations against the nations. The editors who brought the book to its final edition, whatever else they added and rearranged, they left it that way. The book of the prophet begins with the God of nations, who is a God of war, going to war against the northern kingdom of Israel and the near neighbors surrounding Israel. There were no exemptions, it seemed, from this warrior God. We are, I think, disturbed by the image of the warrior God. Generally, I suppose we abhor the thought of war, and there has been a reduction in international warfare. Conflicts today tend to be of a rather different nature. But militaristic mindsets do tend to live on, and they find expression sometimes in acts of remembrance in some settings. For most, though, war is abhorrent and a war God disturbing. What are we to do with Amos's war God on the war path among the nations? We may need to live with ambiguity. The Bible has a lot to say about war and violence because that was the reality of life for a small community of people surrounded not only by small powers struggling for their place in a world dominated by successive empires and superpowers, whose working motto was might is right. The God of war may be primarily a theological claim, making 2 important points. In Jerome Cray's words, God as warrior is meant to confront those oppressed by the evil forces of the world. Therefore, many objections to God as warrior are bourgeois. We might need to ask ourselves if objecting to a warrior God is our particular participation in the injustice and the violence of injustice in the world. Second, as Cray puts it, to confess the Lord is warrior is to recognize the reality of evil and to claim that God is in conflict with evil in the world. Now, if like Amos, we have a moral image of God, then we do not believe in a God who is indifferent to evil and injustice that is destroying eco-human life. God is not morally neutral, nor can we be neutral. We still may feel abhorrence when God uses the same warring, or seems to use the same warring and violent tactics of the Pharaoh the same raw and violent power of the empire to liberate oppressed slaves from that empire. We are disturbed by a biblical book like Joshua, which on a literal reading portrays God as kind of butcher of Canaan. We are perhaps responding then out of moral sensitivity, and from the same sensitivity we, like Amos and the prophetic tradition, are actively opposed to evil and injustice against humans and against the environment. Indeed, we might be complicit in the evil and injustice through perhaps our white supremacy, our privilege, or as beneficiaries of imperial and Western hegemony. We are caught perhaps in various ambiguities, and those ambiguities are moral and theological. Now, what do we make? Let's open it up. What do we make of Amos's war god? Is that something we're comfortable with? Or if we're uncomfortable, why? Let's have a conversation for a few minutes, and then we'll think about rooms and groups with a more focused question. Let's take a look at God of Nations before we have some other general discussion together. The book of Amos begins by putting his activity in historical and socio-political context. And this is always, I think, the context in which faith is formed and is active. God is then proclaimed by Amos as the warrior God who comes in judgment, waging holy war against the enemies of justice and compassion. And in poetic language, and we need to remember that most of the prophets do appear or are expressed in poetry and poetic language, but in poetic language, God roars like a lion at the very beginning of the book and brings drought on the earth. This God of Nations, active in judgment, is also very much part of the poetry of Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel. The prophetic rhetoric affirms that God is in control of nations and destiny, ultimately God as sovereign and involved in history. Therefore, the nations are responsible and accountable for their oppressive and inhuman treatment of the weak and the powerless. Amos accused Israel's foreign neighbors of military atrocities against pregnant women and their unborn children, Amos 1, verse 13. They were accused of deporting innocent people in order to sell them as slaves, the dehumanizing commodification of people. That's Amos 1, verses 6 and 9. The difference between the indictment of Amos and the major prophets such as Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel is that the latter indict the great powers, the big empires, while Amos indicts the small neighboring states. Powers, great or small, are not above the moral law of the universe or accountability to the sovereign God of history. The latter is a theological or faith claim, alongside of which Amos can use the language of natural law, or as we might say, secular language. The God of Nations and judgment is encountered in Amos chapter 1, verse 3, and chapter 2, verse 3. The crimes, and he lists a whole litany of them, the crimes of Damascus, Edom, Ammon, Moab are war crimes, and this may also be true of Gaza and Tyre. The northern kingdom of Israel has been the victim of war crimes, a repeated evil, and a gross injustice in human history. Amos and his audience, whether in the 8th century or in the 5th century when the final text of the book was reached, they are familiar with war and war crimes. The warrior God who comes in judgment is based on the Exodus tradition, which is where it was believed Yahweh made war against Pharaoh and liberated the oppressed slaves. Now, Yahweh, in the theological perspective of Amos, had become a warrior as an advocate for the oppressed. If God is on anyone's side, it is only on the side of the socio-economically and politically crushed and oppressed. This is why Amos encapsulates the primary purpose of the warrior God for humanity in two words: justice and righteousness, or right relations based on justice. The wrongs for which the nations are held accountable are, again, war crimes, a common denominator, the violation of basic norms of human community, especially in the context of war. And in a whole series of verses in the first two chapters, Amos lines out the evil of genocide, fratricide, non-combatant immunity, and the violation of rights for the proper burial of the dead. And in these indictments, Amos makes no appeal to Israel's covenantal tradition. He does not need theology at this point. It's been put this way: these neighboring nations were breaking international standards set forth in interstate treaties, written laws that regulate acceptable social behavior in the ancient Near East. Amos is aware of those agreements and treaties, aware of the rules of engagement widely acceptable and accepted by the peoples of the ancient Near East. He also understands, if you like, the international standards for war as a theological issue, and the ethical guidelines as a critical concern for God's engagement in history. Question is, though, does the warrior God also behave by the international standards of natural law? And yet, God is not indifferent to evil and injustice. Amos does not stop there. He goes on to speak the unspeakable and think the unthinkable. The warrior God of nations will also deal with the covenantal people of Judah and Israel. They too are accountable. Walter Brueggemann describes it this way: the chosen peoples are here treated like all other peoples, subject to the same requirements and marked for the same judgments, without exception, for special status. Ancient Israel's ethical values and theology are here turned upside down. There was a very strong expectation, a phrase that we find in the prophets and Amos, a strong expectation of the coming day of the Lord, when the God of nations would come in judgment on those enemies and give Israel victory. Now the expected day of light would be the day of darkness, as Yahweh fights not for, but against Israel. Amos 5, verses 18 and 20. Israel was not only failing to meet international standards, but had failed to practice the covenantal standard of Sinai, and had forgotten the liberation from the evil, injustice, and oppression of Pharaoh. The most searing indictment of all by Amos is that his book is about the death of Israel and God's part in that death. The chosen people would cease to be. By 722 BCE, the superpower of Assyria had wiped the northern kingdom of Israel off the map and wiped them from history. Amos makes for uncomfortable reading. We are disturbed by the God of war and disturbed by the thought of God's judgment in history, especially when any sense of chosenness or exceptionalism can seemingly be turned on its head. Nothing is guaranteed to last. And every superpower and empire has become historical wreckage. Hubris and the violation of the basic norms of human community, especially in warfare, bring powers and kingdoms to an end. Even natural law cannot be treated with contempt. For Amos, judgment is the direct action of God. That's his theological perspective. The warrior God is directly responsible. This is his theological worldview. It is, in that sense, a biblical worldview in which the world of the biblical perspective is a world without secondary cause. There is only one cause of life and death, blessing and judgment, the God who kills and the God who brings to life. Now, this biblical worldview may not be ours. We do think in terms of secondary causes. We may have a more secular worldview, no less void of judgment and accountability. In the Jewish reading of the Hebrew Bible, there are distinctions made between laws meant for Jews and moral laws which are universal. A book like Leviticus, which everyone has read at bedtime, sets out rituals and laws which Jews would say only apply to them. The prologue to the Hebrew Bible, Genesis chapters 1 to 11, is universal for humankind. There are 7 commandments given to Noah after the flood, and in Jewish understanding, these are for universal humanity. Genesis 9, verses 8 to 17. All nations are held accountable to the Noahide covenant, a natural law, or as the Jewish Paul put it in Romans, laws of conscience that make every person accountable for their actions. And the first natural law of the Noahide covenant is to establish courts of justice. Justice is universal, natural law. Without justice, legal, social, economic, political, and environmental justice, life together goes out of sync, becomes dysfunctional and destructive. Now today, we have human rights standards and legislation, human rights courts, European and United Nations. We have international courts before which war criminals can be tried, The Hague, for example. We have war conventions and increasingly important networks of just peace. There are agreements on weaponry. Of course, there is more to be done to strengthen international treaties and institutions for peace in the world. But these are the mechanisms by which nations can be held accountable and evil and injustice can be opposed. The European Union is itself a community of nations built, founded on justice and peace, and which of course needs renewal and reform to fulfill some kind of peace vocation in the world, a changing world order with power moving from west to east, and a strong, united and peace-building Europe may well be a global essential. Our worldview may perhaps not be the biblical worldview, and it doesn't have to be. But as people of faith, and some 85% of the world population are of faiths, we underpin our worldview with core faith values and ethics, especially the heart of Amos's ethic, social justice and right relationships that are based on justice. We are not biblical literalists about a worldview or a war god, but we are still serious, I think, about a biblical theology and ethics. Okay, just at the point where my voice is giving up, it's probably time to go into rooms for a few minutes at least. 15 minutes maybe. There are 2 questions. You may not get beyond the first or even beyond the second, but Does the biblical worldview make sense for us any longer? And how much is our worldview secular today? And then, would Amos be a strong advocate for human rights today? How can we build a world free of oppression and war crimes and injustices? Let's take 15 minutes